So welcome to the Bill Ballantine Memorial Lecture. This is a lecture we have every year. Well, it's called a lecture, but it's actually a few presentations tonight. And it's as part of Seaweek. We have it each year as part of the Seaweek activities, which is organised by Mels here. And it's a chance for us to talk about issues in the marine environment, following on sort of Bill's legacy in terms of talking about marine conservation, changes in the marine environment, and sort of talking also about some of the research that's happening at the University of Auckland. But you'll see from tonight's list of speakers, we also have a bit more of an international view of what's going on. So Bill was obviously renowned for his I don't know if we say longevity, but his at least looking at things over a long term. His this is a picture of him out on his reef, pondering, I'm not sure what, but he spent a lot of time looking at the reef here and looking at the changes and trying to understand really what was behind the changes that he was observing. And that really is important now in a world where the oceans are changing, well, the climate's changing, the oceans are changing, and the ecology is changing. So that's the theme of tonight, and we just happen to very fortuitously have two marine ecologists that are in the country. One on sabbatical here, Chris Harley, who's on sabbatical for the year, and Adriana, Verges, who is here for tonight. She's come for a PhD exam tomorrow, and I'd kind of double booked and then realised, well, we can actually do the thing tonight and the exam tomorrow, and it works out perfectly. So both of these guys are kind of experts on how environmental change is affecting marine ecology. So they're the first. Chris is first, then Adriana, and then I thought we need someone local to talk about how things are changing and how the environment's changing around New Zealand. The marine environment, and it was too late to get anyone else to do it, so I have to do it. So that's the plan of attack for tonight. The three seminars, and then Mels is going to finish off the evening, and this is something we do every year at this event, is give out the Ocean Champion Award, which is part of Seaweek. So she'll talk more about that towards the end. So thanks for all coming out tonight. It's hard to drag yourself out after work, so it's really appreciated people come along at this time. So first up, we're going to have Chris Harley talking about the changing ecology of rocky shorelines. Chris did his PhD with Bob Payne, which anyone who's got a little bit of marine ecology background will know who Bob Payne is. If you think of sea stars, keystone species, Bob was a giant in the field of marine ecology, and Chris, being Bob's only PhD student that was ever taller than him, is also a giant in his field, in a number of ways. Chris does work on obviously how marine ecosystems are affected by climate change. A lot of his work's on rocky shores, and that's what he's going to be talking about today. He did his PhD with Bob at University of Washington, then did a couple of postdocs in California, which was where I met him at a conference, and then ended up sleeping on his floor, which is where I met his wife, Christina. So, things sort of, connections in the marine ecology world are, quite common. And then since 2005, he's been on the faculty at University of British Columbia. And the really cool connection, I think, tonight is that Chris has come to New Zealand looking to see what sort of old data is out there, to see how our intertidal rocky, sorry, getting a bit thirsty or hungry, one or the other, I'm not sure. How our rocky intertidal shores have changed in New Zealand, and are some of those changes related to climate change? And so he's actually been one of the first people to go back to some of Bill Ballantine's plots on the shore and see how they've changed. So he's going to be talking about how changes have occurred in British Columbia, but also some changes that we've seen on the shores up around Lee. So take it away, Chris. Thanks for giving us your time. Got that.
Okay. Can people in the back hear me okay without the microphone? Terrific. So thank you for the invitation for this. I have been a fan of Bill Ballantine's, although I never got to meet the man. I feel like I've gotten to know him a bit through his work and through the people that he's interacted with. And in some cases, I've followed quite literally in his footsteps, looking at the same little patch of shoreline that he did. And I'll get to that at the end of my presentation, but I'll start sort of more generally with what I find interesting about climate change and why long-term perspectives like Bill was able to generate are important. But since I always forget the acknowledgments at the end because I'm too excited on my conclusion slide that I never advance to the next one, I did want to thank particularly my students and postdocs who've made this work really enjoyable. My family, who's been really involved in the stuff that we've been doing here while we're on sabbatical in New Zealand for the year. And you can sort of see the difference between the climate in British Columbia, Canada, versus the climate in Lee up at the top. So it's nice to be in Lee, especially at this time of year. So for those who don't have much of a background on climate change in the oceans, I have just a quick schematic, because there's a few changes that you might think about based on our experience on land, and a few things that you might not. So what you probably already know is that humans are doing various things that are putting greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and that has a variety of effects on our planet. It is increasing the temperature of the atmosphere through the greenhouse effect. That's been known for a very long time now. It's also heating up our oceans, and so I believe Nick will be talking about trends in sea surface temperature from New Zealand when he presents. We're also seeing changes in precipitation, which when you live in a coastal city with large rivers like Vancouver, can have very important impacts on the ecology of coastal marine environments because it changes how salty the coastal waters are. We have sea level rise as the water heats up and as glaciers, land-based glaciers melt and ice caps melt, sea level is coming up. And then as CO2 is dissolved into the ocean, we have ocean acidification. So this is just a few of the things that are happening in our changing oceans. And I certainly don't have time to talk about all of these, but I'll talk about the consequences of rising air temperature, which matters a lot when the tide is low. And I'll talk about changes in salinity, because there's some neat stuff from Western Canada that comes into play with that. Okay, so why should we be concerned about climate change at all? Well, there's several reasons. One, there's a lot of species out there that we care about in some way that will be impacted. So where I'm from, the abalone up on top is endangered now. It used to be a harvested species, but it was over-harvested, and now we've had to list it federally. The red sea urchin that you can see all the spines poking up, that's still an important fishery species that's worth millions of dollars a year to the coastal economy. So things like that we care about for conservation reasons or for fisheries reasons. There's a lot of species that are also quite ecologically important, so kelp forests and seagrass beds that provide habitat, nursery areas for fish and for crabs. They provide a lot of services, so we don't have to do those things to generate a fishery, because the natural species that are there are helping with that. And then finally, there's just all the diversity in the sea, or in this case in this tide pool, which is really interesting. And I can give you ecological arguments why that diversity is important, because it increases the resilience in the face of disturbance and things like that. But it just makes me happy to know that that's there. So if we don't need to lose that diversity and that beauty, then I think it's worth fighting to try to keep that. Now, all these photos are from British Columbia, but we have in New Zealand abalone and other important grazers. We have really crazy cool seaweeds that form habitat. We have pretty anemones that live in tide pools with the pink coralline algae. So the types of things I'm going to talk about from Canada also apply ecologically here. Okay, now I work on rocky shores for a reason. It's not just that they're beautiful and I find them really interesting. They're really perfect for studying the effects of climate change. And that's because a lot of things already live really close to their tolerance limits. So if it gets just a little bit hotter, stuff dies, right? And that makes it easy for me to go out and say, oh, wow, look, a lot of whole, dead mussels. And it was very, very hot in this past week. I wonder if there's a connection. I don't have to use the sophisticated techniques that a lot of biologists are quite good at. So basically, I'm telling you that I can be really dumb and still understand some of the things that are happening on rocky shores. The other thing that I love is the strong interactions between species. So this is a sea star. Its name is Pisaster. It's actually the one that Bob Payne worked on. And I've turned it over here, and you can see that it's clutching a mussel in its clutches, whatever sea stars have, tube feet, and it's prying it open, and it's having that for lunch. And so the predation that those sea stars impart on the mussel bed is really important in determining where on the shore the mussels live. There's also all kinds of other interactions happening in this photo. The mussels are competing with the barnacles for space. The sea anemones are green in part because they have endosymbiotic algae in their tissues, so there's mutualisms and competition and parasitism and predation and all that stuff. And when you combine those physical forces with the biological interactions, you get pattern. And that is the kind of thing that you can keep track of through time in addition to the mere abundances of organisms. So when thinking about how rocky coasts are changing in terms of their ecology, two of the first things that I would suggest measuring are abundance. So are mussels becoming more or less common in terms of how many there are, or are the sea stars more or less common? And then changes in zonation. So if the mussel bed is getting pushed down, that might suggest that conditions are getting more harsh and they can't handle it up high. Or if the mussel bed if the lower edge is moving, that suggests that something is happening with the predator. So we can sort of solve some of these puzzles by investigating these patterns of zonation. All right, so I'll give you an example that involves sea stars and mussels, and it also involves this convenient thermal gradient that we have from the outer coast of British Columbia in towards Vancouver, which you can see to the upper right there. So the star on the far left is where the Banfield Marine Sciences Station is. It's really a marine-influenced climate. It's cool, it's foggy, you have to wear multiple layers to do your field work. And then as you come through this body of water, which is the Strait of Juan de Fuca towards Victoria, you get into the rain shadow of the mountains, many more sunny days, air temperatures are warmer. And if you put little temperature loggers out on the rock, you can show that those coastal sites tend to be cool and the inland sites tend to be warm. And I was very enamored of this pattern because I am inherently impatient and I do not wish to wait 50 years to see what climate change is going to do. But I can use what's called a space for time substitution. So if the cool sites represent the present, maybe the warm sites represent what the cool sites are going to look like in the future. And they already look quite different. So here's one of the cool sites, Tatoosh Island. You can see it has this really sort of striking layer cake zonation pattern with barnacles at the top and then a seaweed and then the mussel bed and then there's a baby seal in there for local color and then kelps and then seagrasses. And if you go to one of the hot sites, there's still barnacles and there's some seaweeds, but there's no mussel bed anymore. So that's changed. You don't have the intertidal kelps anymore. And these two photos, it's not that I don't know how to crop things in Photoshop. It's that they're at about the same vertical scale. So you can see that sort of higher high tide line, the mid tide, and the sort of the average good low tide. So notice where the barnacles are on the left, that sort of yellowish beige band, versus on the right. That upper limit is forced downwards when you go from a cool site to a warm site. And I think that's quite important. So here's the cartoon of what that looks like, where again you've got the intertidal gradient vertically and then this increasing stress gradient from cool sites to warmer sites here. And I think that the upper limits of things like barnacles and mussels are getting pushed down. But remember how there's no mussel bed at the hot site. That requires an additional piece to the story to explain it. I think the reason for that may be that there is some consumer that is prowling around on the low shore that would prevent those barnacles and mussels from living lower at the hot site. So that's why there's that cutoff there. And so we can test this hypothesis largely observationally and a little bit experimentally. So part one is, do upper limits actually come down when you go from cool shores to warm shores? And here is a bunch of data for one of our common species of barnacles. It was originally described by Charles Darwin, which is kind of neat. And from left to right, you go from cooler to warmer, and then you can see that a position of the upper limit is coming down. The hotter sites, it is lower because they just can't be out of the water for as long. They have to live lower down. And then there's a second species of barnacle, same pattern, and two species of mussels, same pattern each time. So that top part of the pattern seems to be good, and now what we need is something that sets that lower limit, and that is probably going to be our friend Pisaster, the voracious sea star, which is known to really feast on barnacles and mussels and determine their lower limits. So if you put Pisaster's distribution on here, there's lots of variation from one place to the next, but there's no real trend. At the cool sites, it can forage up pretty high. At the hot sites, it can forage up pretty high. So that suggests that it might be able to eat all of the, say, mussels at the hottest sites. So if we just take those sort of the trend lines out of these plots and just show the data, because scientists like to simplify, there might be a lot of sort of predator-free space up high on the shore at the cool sites, but then that squeezes down to very little or perhaps none when you get to the warm sites. So here is a re-envisioning of that diagram where we have those sessile species like barnacles and mussels being forced down, and now there's this wall of stomachs down low on the shore just waiting to digest any foolish barnacle and mussel that settles out of the plankton at that shore level. So that is also a testable idea, and we can do that by just removing sea stars and seeing what happens. So I put out cages on the rock that keeps the sea stars out, and this is nice because I don't have to show graphs, I can just show pictures. The cage, this will give you a little bit of an idea how old this experiment was. So it used to be that an inbox was a physical thing on your desk that you put paper in, and you could buy them in large quantities at the beginning of the email era because nobody used them anymore, turn them upside down and bolt them to the rock, and sea star exclusion experiment. So this is an old inbox that's folded away from the rock. The outside is what, and this is at the hot site, right? So there's no mussel bed here naturally. And on the outside of the cage, it's mostly bare rock and a scruffy little barnacle species that's so energetically worthless that Pisaster rarely bothers to eat it. And then inside the cage, after just a few months, it's now this lush bed of the sort of the tastier barnacle species. And you can see that a few other things are starting to come in. Some of the seaweeds are on the inside that aren't on the outside. And the little dark areas in the middle are the beginnings of a mussel bed. It's just wee little tiny mussels that are coming in. And on this island, it is virtually impossible to find mussels because the sea stars eat them when they are tiny, tiny, tiny. And after a year, that cage becomes a mussel bed. And just side to side, top to bottom, and I sort of got pretty cocky because I was like, that's right, I have created a new habitat on this island. I am like a god. And I would taunt the sea stars because I knew that this is their favorite food and they could smell it. And so I just pictured them, at high tide coming up and pressing up against the sides of the cage. Like, oh, if only I could get into the cage, which occasionally they could do, bastards. So somehow those two have squeezed in through the roof and ate the entire mussel bed. So it was a bummer for my replication and statistics, but it was nice because now the inside of the cage looks just like the outside again, which is pretty good evidence that it's sea stars that cause that and not, say, shade from the cage. Okay, so this is the way I think things work in space. As you get to hotter areas, those upper limits are getting pushed down, but they can only go so far before they're cut off by that dangerous predator. And so that all seems to make sense in space. But remember, the main question of interest is time. So if we change that left to right to warming through time instead of a gradient in space, do we see the same thing? You will also remember me mentioning that I was not patient enough to wait for 50 years Well, it didn't occur to me that I could also look to 50 years ago and compare that to the present. And we know that over the past 50, 60 years, things have been warming in coastal British Columbia. This is from the airport in Victoria, which is about halfway along that gradient on the map I showed you. And so it's, in the summertime, almost 3.5 degrees warmer than it used to be. And so here's the photo of the map again, and those are the sites that I did the spatial comparison. And when I arrived at UBC, it occurred to me to go to the library and look for old theses. And I found one by a guy named Bill Widdowson, and he had measured zonation patterns at all the yellow-starred sites along the south coast of Vancouver Island. And this is very exciting, because I don't know if the next time you're in the library, go to the thesis section and pull one out from the 1950s, because I guarantee that it hasn't moved in decades, and open it and smell it, because it just smells like old, knowledge. And in the back of Widdowson's thesis, there's this little appendix that each site has like 3 sentences. Go to the end of Rock Bottom Creek and turn left and go 900 meters, and you will see a rock formation like this, and then take your sample. And he sort of neglected to mention that there's a big cliff and a waterfall at the end of that creek, and then you turn left and it's just like more sheer cliff, because he was really hardcore. But he's also still alive, so he emailed me all the Google Earth coordinates for his sites, which was super helpful. And when he did his surveys in the late 50s, the upper edge of the barnacles is where that triangle is, the upper edge of the mussel bed is the white circle, the lower edge of the mussel bed is the black circle. And when I came back out 52 years later, just like that gradient in space, and this gradient of warming through time, we have this squeeze from above that's forcing things down lower on the shore. And so over half a century, we've lost just over half of the vertical extent of the mussel bed in southwestern British Columbia. And we would not have known that if it weren't for this historical data. We would not be worried about it. We would not be thinking about, well, what other things are changing. So having that older data was really quite important. And in fact, at 3 of the 14 sites that used to have mussels, they are no longer there. So there have been local extinctions where that collapse has been complete. Okay, so my worry is that we'll have, glorious shorelines that look like this now with a big, rich mussel bed that harbors hundreds of species that like to live in with the mussels. And we'll start to look like places like Saddlebag Island, the hot site, where you lack the mussel bed and species richness is much, much lower. Okay, so that is a gradient across temperature. There are also some interesting patterns with salinity. So Vancouver is the urbanized area sort of to the left of the F in Fraser River. And UBC is the little green area out at the point there where you can see the Fraser River plume coming out, all that sediment. So the fresh water from the Fraser fills up the southern Strait of Georgia every summer when all the snow from the ski hills and further inland melts out. And that makes a big difference to the coastal salinity. So if you look at an outer coast site like Banfield, that's the small dots at the top, it's pretty salty all year round. But in Vancouver, and this is the site that's close enough to where we live that I can walk the dog there, which is why I have these data, the salinity is high in the winter, but then it drops way down in May and June and July as the snow melt is coming out and then rises back up. So it could be that you have sites like this, which are hot but salty, looking quite different than sites like this in Vancouver, which are also hot but are seasonally fresh. And all that black is mussel bed. So if you look at where the mussels are, they're in sort of the starred areas in the southern Strait of Georgia. But as soon as you get behind some of those barrier islands or around corners, you end up at the sites with the, I don't know what to call those, no smoking symbols, where there are no mussel beds. And if we're wondering why there are mussel beds in the southern Strait of Georgia, the Fraser River is probably a pretty good place to look for influence. Okay, so here's the hypothesis. We know that Piesaster eats the mussel middlist and can affect its distribution. I can also show you, although I won't, from lab experiments that low salinity stress is quite bad for Piesaster. It turns into sort of like the curio shop thing and can't hold on. And mussels, they don't love low salinity, but they can certainly survive it for several weeks and then do fine as the fall sets in. So let me set this up. So students of mine and I went to a whole bunch of sites at sort of different distances from the Fraser River to see what that might do to some of these zonation patterns. And in this case, The upper edge of the mussel bed, which is those white triangles, stayed about the same place. Didn't matter if it was salty or fresh. But the lower limit, where it was fresh, the mussel bed went way down to the bottom edge of the intertidal zone. And the saltier you get, the higher up the shore that goes. And that coincides with where Piesaster is found on the shore. So I'll just fill in gray sort of where the mussel bed is. So you have this pattern where the mussel bed is getting squeezed, but now from the bottom. Okay, so if you've dealt with scientists before, you may have noticed that we tend to simplify things and present something like this and say, okay, so you have a mussel bed, and then there's a little gap, and then there's a giant pile of sea stars. Sometimes that's the way the world really is there's a mussel bed, and then there's this little gap, and there's this giant pile of sea stars. So again, I don't have to be a rocket scientist to wonder if the lower edge of the mussel bed has something to do with that army of predators right there. And in fact, we can do the experiment again and show that, yes, where sea stars can forage, they eat the mussels, and where you have a full cage, they don't. And that cage to the right actually is missing 2 of its walls. That's to separate out sea star predation from something like surf scoters, which is a diving duck. Okay, so we now know that low salinity stress does affect Piesaster, and that Piesaster then affects mussels. So indirectly, mussels actually like this periodic low salinity. What does this have to do with climate change? Well, the warmer it gets, the less of our precipitation falls as snow in Western Canada. So this is a modeling paper that shows how things change through the future and shows the Fraser River outflow from January all the way to December. And it's modeled for the year 2000 and then for 2020 and 2050 and 2080. And you can see the peak gets a little bit earlier. That's because spring is arriving sooner. It also gets lower because there's less snow to melt. It's now fallen as rain at other times of year. And we've seen this through time already. So this is the peak discharge, and lots of variation from one year to the next, but the trend is less or a lower peak. And this is how salty a nearby site is. Again, lots of year-to-year variation that sort of mirrors the river outflow. And that is increasing through time. So that would suggest that as river discharge is reduced, salinity stress should be reduced because it's getting saltier. That should be good for Piesaster, which should be bad for mussels. So is there any evidence for that change? I have not found that magical, musty old thesis with the data, but sometimes you get fortunate in other ways, and that came from talking to one of the property owners on this stretch of beach just a little northwest of Vancouver. And he used to come out to this site when he was a kid in the 1950s, Gord, with his sister Carol and a cousin whose name he did not tell me. And they would climb up onto that rock, and you can see how many mussels there were in 1957. And then after talking to us, he climbed back up there with his sister in 2008, so again, half a century later. And now the mussel bed has been pushed up into just this narrow little ribbon as a belt around the waistline of that rock. And okay, so this is only one site and 2 time points, but it's consistent with that idea that again, through time, we're seeing this change, which is consistent with what we would expect from what we could measure in space. All right, so it looks like everything is coming up Piesaster, right? It likes it when it's warmer. It does well when it's saltier. It actually likes ocean acidification because it's easier to eat its prey. So are we living now in a world where hordes of Piesaster are taking over and we're all in jeopardy? Not so fast, Piesaster, because here are some long-term data that I've been working on. This paper is on the verge of being accepted, so you're the first audience to actually see this graph. Piesaster is the black dots up there, and from 2007 up through about 2010, it was the dominant sea star around Vancouver. And then, starting in about 2013, something happened, and its numbers went down, and it got replaced by this other species, the gray one there called Evasterius. And the reason for that replacement is that Piesaster is one of the 20 or so species vulnerable to sea star wasting syndrome, which is this catastrophic disease that's affecting the West Coast, which causes sea stars' arms to fall off, but not die immediately. So they sort of crawl away, and then another one falls off and crawls away, and then eventually the sea star dissolves into white goo, and it's a really depressing slow-motion death. And the numbers of sea stars that have died are almost uncountable. It's an incredible number. And I'll just show you that these are the data that we've collected from around Vancouver, and this is to get you ready for the next figure, which is more sites. Where you see blue, that means the population is larger than normal. Where you see red, that means it is smaller than normal. And the outbreak was in 2013, which is where that vertical line is. And you can see that there's a trend for declines after 2013 in British Columbia. Now, I'm not the only one who counts sea stars. There's a lot of people that do that from Alaska to California. So if you look at the effect of that disease from Alaska all the way down to Southern California, look at that just column of red after 2013. The declines have been as high as 99.9%, especially in Southern California where it's warmer. So this is an example of how historical data can be really useful for documenting a pattern and generating hypotheses like, why is this happening? What caused the outbreak? What are the consequences for the nearshore environment going to be? So I would say that this, in addition to using long-term data to test existing hypotheses, it's really useful for developing new hypotheses. All right, now I want to conclude with a little bit more on Bill Ballantine. So here's this wonderful picture from the New Zealand Geographic of him on his patch on a echinoderm reef at the Goat Island Marine Reserve. So that's Goat Island in the background to the left and the Lee Marine Laboratory in the background to the right. And he collected excellent data from that area and left big drill holes in the rock that allows us to map out the exact spot. So there's, you can see the transect tape weaving back and forth. That marks out Bill's area. So I've gone back and recounted everything that he has counted. And you will see in the foreground, let's see if I can do it. Right there is a chiton, which is a grazer. He was especially interested in the grazers because just like the sea stars in Western Canada, which are important controllers of everything else that happens on the shore, the grazers are really important agents of control in New Zealand. So he kept track of these four grazers in particular. So you've got two snails, which are sort of the light grazers, and then the chiton and this big limpet, which are the heavy-duty grazers. And so I've been able, with Nick's help, to relocate these and then resurvey them. And so the first of those snails, you can see there's lots of variation that Bill documented through time. That's everything from 1987 to about 2009. And then here's my 2 data points out there in 2018-19. So for this species, nothing especially interesting has happened over that amount of time. There may have been a bit of an increase in wider variation during the year. For the second species of snail, well, that one's low right now. But it's not exceptionally low compared to the historical record, because there have been time periods where it's been that low. But it does seem like there used to be more in the 90s, and then starting in about 2002 or so, they became a little bit less abundant. It's the heavy-duty grazers that have me a little bit concerned about how the system is changing. So here's the chiton, which is now at its lowest biomass in the entire record. And the limpet, and this is now counts. Take note of the axis, which is log transform. So in the sort of 10 square meters that he measured, he could get over 1,000 limpets in that area on some of his survey dates. And I'm finding 33, 29. So the numbers of those big grazers have come way down. Why? I don't know, but I'm very excited because now we have the question to ask is, what is driving this change? So is it that the air temperatures are warmer? They are. It doesn't necessarily line up with the timing of the declines very well. Is it that the sea is more acidic? It's not hugely more acidic around the northeast coast of New Zealand. Is it the weird little harmful algal species that blooms along the shore? It could be. The timing of that lines up pretty well. So we now know what questions to ask, and we can start testing some of those ideas. All right, and in terms of figuring out some of the more details, so anyone in the room younger than about, 40 would look at your photos on your phone. Back in the day, you look at your photos on photographic slides like the one Bill's holding up. So he has a photographic record of all those plots that extends back 20, 30, 32 years. So we're going to take advantage of that to see what other species might be changing in this system using the data he's collected. So I'll just wrap up with a couple of closing thoughts. One is that historical long-term data are really, really important because they help us demonstrate that climate change isn't just a problem for the future. It is something that we have lived through for decades already, and we just need to look in order to realize that. Second, long-term data can be used to test hypotheses that we already have. It's like, all right, I think warming should do this. Let's go back and find some old data and compare the past to the present. But they also help us generate new hypotheses. Oh, geez, what's the importance of this harmful algal bloom? It looks like things are changing. Let's do a lab experiment and see if that matters. And then finally, we really need this sort of basic ecological data to understand and manage our natural environment. It's not always the sexiest thing that the funding agencies like to fund, but without this, we'd basically be helpless in figuring out how things are changing and then what, if anything, to do about it. So, Nick, I don't know if you wanted questions at the end, if there's time for them, or if we should...
Oh, there's time. First, okay. I think we should thank you for a great talk. And I don't know, from a personal perspective, it's pretty amazing to see, some recent data from the plot. I think that's really cool. So, yeah, any questions for Chris?
The predation, why the regulars are going down with the chitin from the...
Oh, yeah. So are the chitins and limpets rare now because of predators? I was talking with the dock ranger who said, oh, I thought I read something that there was a fish that likes to eat chitins and limpets. I was like, oh, tell me more. And it's kelpfish or kiwi. And I was like, wow, maybe this is it. It's a marine reserve, and maybe that fish is becoming more abundant. So I looked into the trends of kiwi, and actually they hate the reserve. They much prefer to be outside of the reserve. So it's not obviously a predator, but I can't rule it out because maybe there's something that loves to eat limpets and pegs that I haven't thought of.
In terms of historical records, like specifically in the West, have you guys utilized, like, you have a lot of those facilities trends that would know a lot, have a lot of epistemology, like changing trends. So
Yeah.
Have been utilized?
Yeah. It is, and a lot of the work that I'm now doing on the central coast of British Columbia joins much more closely with what First Nations are both interested in knowing and what they know. But the best example I can think of off the top of my head is actually Anne Solomon, who Nick knows really well, who's worked with coastal communities in Alaska and figured out, well, okay, patterns of fisheries depletion line up fairly well with technological advances like the outboard motor, which allows you to access more sites in a different way. So yes, I think incorporating that perspective is quite important because it goes back quite a lot farther than the Western research tradition on coastlines like BC's or like New Zealand's. One more here.
So for your sites in British Columbia, the outer sites versus the inner sites, the cages excluded the starfish, but how did you have any issues with human predation? Because I imagine there's more people further inland versus on the coast. And how did you have anyone tampering with cages to try to hit the mussels? Or?
No, and like low tide harvest of mussels is much less of a thing in BC than it is here, where it's like, let's go out and get some green-shelled mussels. And I'm not sure exactly why that is culturally different. But I don't think it was human presence. The worst thing that I saw, and this was from a friend's experiment, not mine, was we were working in one part of the shore counting things for her, and we hear this wham, 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 and it's a kayaker just beating the tar out of one of her cages. I'm like, what are you doing? I just wanted to see what it was. So, well, we can tell you. So, I mean, we're not without human influence, but in this particular case, I don't think it explains that pattern. But that's a good question. It's always important to think about how humans might be involved, because we tend to think of ourselves as being separate from the ecosystem, but we're not.
Sorry, mind saying, but what's causing that Isasol disease? I haven't heard of it.
Oh, it is a virus. And for a while, they thought they knew exactly which virus, and now it's like, God, geez, that clearly isn't the entire story. It's not clear whether it's just one pathogen or multiple pathogens, but it has been described as one of the largest wildlife disease outbreaks in recorded history because of its extent, the number of species affected, and the magnitude of the declines. First noticed in late August of 2013. Yeah, and you can still find 6 sea stars now, so they haven't fully recovered. Some populations are up, but a lot of them are still quite low.
Some of the species have almost been wiped out, haven't they? Like the big sunflowers.
Well, yeah, people are now talking about, well, should we list as endangered the really big, 20-some armed glorious thing that looks like a trash can lid? Because it's a wonderful sea star, but its numbers, it's exquisitely sensitive to this disease, and it's been really, really badly impacted.
I've got a question. You obviously showed us Bill's the changes in, or the low numbers of limpets and chitons in particular from Bill's plots, but I know you've been sampling a lot of other areas and comparing that to historical data. So do you think it's a local pattern or a larger scale pattern?
Yeah, good question. So I have been to a few other places around the North Island, and a couple weeks ago we went down to Dunedin and sampled on the Otago Peninsula. And we resampled with the kids' help one area with those diloma, and they are more abundant now than they used to be. One of the species and the other species a little less. So that maybe those snails are not hugely affected. But everywhere else we've looked for limpets and chitons, those seem to be low. So it doesn't just seem to be a problem at Lee. It seems to be a problem that is broader throughout at least the eastern side of both the North and the South Island, places that we've visited so far. So that is sort of an important aspect of this, is trying to get to enough places to understand if this is general or if this might just have something to do with a particular location.
I think Australia, some of these changes, I think, extend to the subtidal as well. We're seeing declines in limpets and certain gastropod species subtidally in parts of northern New Zealand. So who knows? I'm glad you haven't just come here for a year and figured it all out.
You're welcome.
Yeah, but we've got the question. Are there any more questions for Chris? No? Well, thanks a lot, Chris. It's very interesting. All right, next up we've got Adriana Verges from University of New South Wales, and we'll be moving down into the underwater environment. Obviously a lot of what Chris has been talking about in the intertidal is sort of climate change and how it affects the air temperatures and therefore the intertidal communities, whereas subtidally things are more influenced by warming oceans. And Adriana, so you did your PhD in Barcelona. Is that where you're from? Yep. I haven't even figured that out. Sorry. So Adriana's here because we've got this defence of a PhD student tomorrow, so it's worked out very well, as I said before. So after your PhD in Barcelona, you did a postdoc in Perth, and obviously liked Australia and decided to stay, and you've been on the faculty at University of New South Wales since 2010, doing work on kelp forests and seaweed restoration and tropicalisation. So Adriana's really sort of done one of the first publications and some of the really big seminal publications really on tropicalisation in temperate regions. So documenting how lots of temperate areas around the world have basically becoming more tropical as things warm up. So we're looking forward to hearing you tell us about it, and yeah, thanks a lot for giving the talk and your short visit here.
Thank you. All right, so I'm from Barcelona, so I have an accent. I'm going to try very hard to speak slowly because we do have a tendency to speak very fast where I come from. But I'm now based in Sydney, beautiful city.
Interrupt for a second. The lights. Are the lights all right? Can everyone see clearly? Mm-hmm. Yeah, all right, we'll leave it. Yeah. I don't know if it'll make any difference, but yeah, that's
all right.
Nice pictures of it.
So I'm based in Sydney, which I haven't dived here yet. I'm going to go for a snorkel tomorrow, but my understanding is that Sydney is not that dissimilar to New Zealand in many ways underwater, in that it's dominated by seaweed forests. They're the main habitat-forming organisms. They're like our mussel beds, but of the underwater world, like our underwater forests, essentially. And as Nick was saying, my work is basically looking at whether these beautiful seaweed forests may be disappearing and whether we may be looking at a situation in the not so distant future where these systems become tropicalized. And instead of having kelp forests, we have coral reefs in places like Sydney. So starting from the beginning though, what do we know about the effects of climate change worldwide so far? This is not a hypothetical. What we already know is that climate change is driving a universal redistribution of life on Earth. This is part of a paper that we published that was led by Greta Peckel from Tasmania, where we look at species that are either they're moving to stay within their thermal tolerance ranges, and they're either moving to higher altitudes or to greater depths in the ocean, or most of them are moving towards the poles. And what we did in this paper is explain and show how these changes in the distribution of species that have already happened are already impacting our health, our culture, our economies, and even the climate itself. And we give a whole bunch of different examples, but just to highlight three here, for example, we see that a shift in the distribution of the mosquitoes that carry malaria higher up the mountain is affecting literally millions of people in some regions of Africa. We know that the distribution of this sea urchin in Australia is leading to the loss of giant kelp forests, which support very important fisheries in Tasmania. And we also know that there's these climate feedbacks where, for example, the greening of the Arctic is reducing the albedo effect of the Earth, and that means that there's less light and heat reflected back, so it's a positive feedback where we're making the world warmer. So we know that there's these direct effects of the climate in the physiology of species, their phenology, their distribution, but some species move and other species do not move in response to climate. So this means that there's also changes in the way different species interact. You know, when a species moves into a new territory, all of a sudden it encounters completely naive prey, and it can create a completely novel interaction. At the same time, some existing interactions that are important we're losing. So combined, this means that climate change is leading to very profound changes in the ecological assemblages, ecological communities. So what we have then is that if this is, say, for example, temperature, abiotic conditions, we have the conditions that we had in the 50s, say, and they're being altered. The world is getting warmer, and we're getting to this end. But because of this, we're also seeing changes in ecological communities where the species that are in an area are also changing, right? So we're going from this historical place to completely novel ecosystems where the combination of the species that are there and the abiotic conditions, things like temperature, salinity, are also completely different. So this has huge implications for conservation, because even the term conservation is to conserve something that was there. That's how we do conservation. We return a species to a certain place, right? Or we try and return an ecosystem to something that we think was healthy. But even if we stop CO2 emissions in the next 15 years, as we should, especially in the ocean, warming is going to continue for at least, a few decades, right? So we are moving in this direction towards completely novel ecosystems where it's actually impossible to return to historical conditions. So what does that mean then? What do we do for conservation? We need new management approaches where we need to make some decisions. What do we conserve? What do we maximize? Is it the services provided by a community, things like fisheries, for example, food? Is it biodiversity because of aesthetic reasons and because of ecological reasons? Or do we just try and, just mimic what was there before as well as we can? Should that be the priority? So these are all like big, big questions, right? And this is kind of the area that my research is kind of going in this direction, because I work in ecosystems that are increasingly completely novel. There's no analog. There's no previous ecosystems that used to look like that. Okay, so back to the species on the move. We know that species are moving particularly fast in the ocean. They're moving at least 4 times faster than on land in response to warming. Different types of organisms here on the x-axis, like algae, cnidarians, mollusks, they move at different speeds. And I just want to draw your attention to these guys here, which are bony fish, which at the leading edge of their distribution are moving really, really fast. We're talking, I think on average, 370 kilometers per decade. So that's very fast. Now, what my research focuses on is a particular type of fish, and they are the herbivorous fish that are moving from tropical areas, from coral reefs, and into temperate ecosystems, kelp forests like the ones that we have in Sydney or in New Zealand. Now, why am I interested in this? Because herbivorous fish play really important functions in coral reef ecosystems. So all these fish that you see here, they're non-stop, constantly grazing. And they're grazing on seaweed. And because they graze on so much seaweed, there's actually no seaweed to be found there at all. And that's what allows corals to dominate the benthos. So if you remove the herbivorous fish, the seaweed would actually take over the corals, right? So a healthy coral reef has lots of herbivorous fish and no seaweed. Now, these systems are also, so they're they're dominated by animals. Most of the primary production is actually directly consumed, and there's a lot of recycling of nutrients. Now, in contrast, temperate reefs, like the ones we have in Sydney or Tasmania or New Zealand, they have seaweed as the main habitat-forming organisms. They provide the habitat. They have these structurally complex holdfasts that are home to hundreds of organisms, and essentially it's a completely different system where very, very little of that seaweed, of that primary production, is directly consumed, only about 20%. The rest of it becomes detached after big storms, becomes detritus, and it fuels other ecosystems, or it ends up in the deep ocean where it may be sequestered. For example, the carbon there may be sequestered. So they function very differently. So you can kind of figure out that when these tropical herbivorous fish that are so voracious, so such big consumers, when they start to intrude these temperate systems, they can completely change the ecosystem. And we are already seeing this. So there is a summary paper, the first that we published on this topic, where we summarized evidence from around the world that shows that these tropical herbivorous fish are indeed shifting their distribution, and they're already causing some sorts of impacts. And I'll just draw to your attention to the fact that in most of these places, this is happening partly because there's these western boundary currents that push warm water from the tropics and into temperate reefs. So with that warm water are the larvae of this herbivorous fish, and that helps with the intrusion. The only exception is here in the Mediterranean Sea, where it's not a boundary current, it's just the Suez Canal that connected the Red Sea and the Indo-Pacific with the temperate Mediterranean. But we see very similar things in all these places, and I'll just, a picture is worth more than 1,000 words, so I'll just show you what's happening, for example, in Japan. So this is a photo from 1990 where the main kelp that is dominant in the area, Eclonia cava, not similar to Eclonia radiata here, dominated the reefs. And by the late 1990s, this kelp started to decline. By 2000, it was barren. And by 2013, it's actually completely dominated by corals. And this is a Cropera, fast-growing corals. I went there in 2014, and I just could not believe that reef used to be once dominated by kelp. So this is what we call, tropicalization of temperate reefs, and this is happening at the warm edge of the kelp distribution. And the main kind of organisms that we think are overgrazing this kelp and leading to this tropicalization, at least in part, are species like this: rabbitfish, a drummer, and a parrotfish. Okay, so my work is in a place called the Solitary Islands. It's in northern New South Wales. Similar latitude, 30 degrees south in the other hemisphere. And we have this relatively long-term data set, which was collected by Hamish Malcolm initially. And this is basically a baited remote video. So this here is a pole, here's the bait, and these videos were deployed in places inside and outside sanctuary zones to look at the fish community. But for a series of reasons that I can tell you about later or another time, we realized that we could use this video footage to look at whether there was kelp in these places or not. So we went back to all these videos. So it's a good example of a long-term data set that ends up being used for something completely different to what it's intended for initially. So we know that in this place there used to be kelp in the early 2000s. 2004, 2008, we started to see a complete disappearance. And after 2009, there was no more kelp at all in these reefs at all, like none. We know because we've done experiments to see, well, is anything feeding on this kelp? Is that part of the reason? And it's actually some of the same species. So again, it's the same rabbitfish species that loves grazing on this kelp, plus the drummer and also some surgeonfish. And there is coral in this area. We don't have good long-term data that shows that coral is expanding in the region, but we're working on it because we know some species are expanding their distribution, but in terms of cover, we haven't worked it out yet. But this tropicalization is not just in the east coast of Australia, it's also happening in the western coast of Australia. This is data from Thomas Wernberg. What happened here was that the kelp was initially disappeared after a heat wave. It was a very, very intense heat wave over many, many months. We think that's what killed the kelp. But then what happened is that these warm water tropical herbivorous fish, like this parrotfish and again some rabbitfish as well and some drummers, they basically increased in numbers. We know they did. And they prevent the kelp from coming back. That's the hypothesis. That's what we think is going on. And Thomas and I are actually doing experiments at the moment in the east and the west coast of Australia where we're putting cages, not dissimilar to Chris's, to try and see whether we get kelp growing back in these places where there used to be kelp, but there is no longer. Now, so what's happening in Australia basically is that we're starting to lose this what we call the biological engine of Australia's Great Southern Reef. And, if you are a marine biologist in Australia, we have this problem that everybody cares about the Great Barrier Reef. It's a lot harder to get people to care about the temperate reef ecosystems, even though what we now call the Great Southern Reef is actually huge. So what we're calling the Great Southern Reef, and there's an intention behind this. By giving it a name, we're hoping that it's going to become better recognized nationally and international. It's 8,000 kilometers long. It's all dominated mostly by one species of kelp, Peclonia radiata. It's worth more than $10 billion per year to the Australian economy. It's a huge endemism hotspot in particular, extremely productive, and it supports Australia's most valuable fisheries. However, most Australians have never heard of it. It receives very, very little research funding. I'll show you some data for this. And it's under threat, as we've seen. So we're losing this kelp. Now, this is data from Scott Bennett's paper from 2016, where they actually went through all the Australian Research Council applications and looked at how much money had been invested into coral reefs versus temperate reefs. And you can see it's 10 times lower for temperate reefs. So we have a problem, basically. So while everybody in Australia and the world over, really, knows about coral bleaching and what's happening in places like the Great Barrier Reef, we need to care just as much about the loss of kelp. But it's a much less known problem, basically. So we need to raise awareness about that. Okay, so I'll just want to now change towards management solutions. I started by talking about, we need to think of new management approaches when we come to these novel ecosystems that are just completely new, right? So what are some of the options? So one of the options, as I mentioned, was, okay, instead of focusing on what species are there, let's focus on what they do. And let's try and conserve that function, whether it's fisheries or productivity, whatever that is. So to do that, some colleagues of mine and I just got a paper accepted in functional ecology where we speculated about what may be the kind of future trajectories that these tropicalized reefs may follow, and how can we conserve these functions. So this is what we may call a historical kelp forest, what used to be. So it provides a series of ecological functions, ecosystem services, things like primary production, fisheries. It supports tourism. So this would be fisheries. This would be biodiversity that is linked to tourism. We know that there's little of the kelp directly consumed, but a lot of it is exported, and that's going somewhere where presumably it's important. So that they're the functions of what was there. What are the potential trajectories going into the future? So one of the possible future trajectories is where we lose the kelp, we lose the trees, the underwater trees, and that gets replaced by low biomass turf. And that is happening in the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. So we've lost our sisters air forest, and now all we have is turf. It doesn't have structural complexity, so what we are seeing there is that there's a loss of biodiversity, there's a loss of fisheries, the fisheries change, they're now kind of tropical, and it's a kind of a poor, depauperate kind of system. Another possibility is what we're seeing in Japan, where we have this kind of novel coral reefs. They're high latitude systems. They're not accreting as such. They're not true coral reefs, but they are coral dominated. Here, most of the primary production is consumed. There's structural complexity because the coral provides that. So, there's different functions, but some of them can be maintained. Like fisheries may even increase a bit, like in terms of the benthic fisheries. Biodiversity increases. So here's another potential trajectory. And there's a third one, which may be these novel kelp ecosystems, novel kelp forests. So these ones, there's two options that we could think of. One is where these species have actually become tolerant of warming and potentially tolerant of these new herbivores that are coming in. So that's not impossible. They may do that naturally, or we may assist that evolution in that direction. So we may do, just like they're doing in coral reefs, right, where there's lots of, like literally millions of dollars being invested into making super corals that are resistant to, bleaching and this and that. We could do the same, potentially. Or these novel kelp forests may be tropical seaweeds that have expanded their distribution. And that is happening to some extent in Japan, where sargassum species, tropical sargassum, is starting to overtake places that used to be dominated by kelp or temperate sargassum. And I believe in the in the Mediterranean, there's some tropical species that are also starting to arrive, which is really interesting. So I guess you will agree with me that these two ones are the ones that we like, right? Because they kind of have important ecosystem functions and services that are similar to what was there before in a way, and they support the things that we need, right, from the ocean, because we are actually dependent on the ocean to a great degree. But as I kind of hinted, in terms of management, if what we want is this or this, we may want to consider some interventionist management approaches, like assisted evolution or assisted migration. And the point we make in the paper is that we need to start talking about it. I'm not saying we should or should not do it, but we should at least talk about it. And there's some interesting, dichotomies here. It's like, I personally love kelp, so I want to go for this one, but lots of people prefer corals, right? So, how do you make the decision? Now, the second option, and it's obviously that this is not an either or, but I'm just throwing out ideas, and I've just chosen two for today, is to change the way we manage our fisheries. For example, a simple one would be, and it's already happening, is to develop new fisheries. Because species are moving, we actually have to change the species we catch, because the ones that we used to catch are no longer there. This is a photo I took from the Sydney, from a fish market where I live, where they're starting to sell rabbit fish. So, this is one of the main species that are eating the kelp, so we could target fisheries for these species and try and reduce their numbers that way. Whether we could ever control their numbers through fishing, I'm not sure. And there's other issues that need to be considered, like bycatch, etc. But here's one potential management approach. And the second one links with Bill Ballantine's legacy, which is marine protected areas. Now, we know from some places, like Tasmania, that marine protected areas can be effective at slowing down or reducing this tropicalization signal. So this is work from Maria Island. Here we can see, for example, that in the places that are protected, the density of this sea urchin, which overgrazes the kelp forest, are much, much lower than in places that are open to fishing. So to some degree, we know that at least for invertebrate grazers, marine protected areas work. They protect the reefs from these new invaders. And we know that other species, these are not herbivores, but these are warm water species that are starting to become more common in places like Tasmania, and they're a lot less abundant inside marine reserves than they are outside. So I guess to just conclude, we cannot stop species on the move. That's the thing about the oceans, right? We can't put a fence. They're going to keep coming. But things that we can do is focus on securing the ecosystem functions of future tropicalized reefs. We can try and enhance the resilience of temperate reefs so that we help them to resist invasion. And I'll just finish up by acknowledging the many, many people that I work with and I brainstorm with and I go diving with who are essential to this work. And I'll take any questions.
Thanks, Adriana. That's really interesting. Got any questions?
You mentioned turf. Is that like seed grass as opposed to kelp?
Turf.
Or is it one of the slides was turf?
Yeah,
Seed
but
grasses.
turf is like super low biomass, like maybe 10 centimeter high. It's a mixture of filamentous algae, sediment. It's mush. But we have whole PhD theses that are trying to answer what is turf. So it's not as simple as that. But I'm calling turf anything that it doesn't have big structural complexity. They're not big canopy forming species.
So as it warms up, it may get too hot for kelps but perfect for corals, unless the variability is increasing, because then it might be too hot for kelps but still too cold for corals. And I don't know enough about the trends for Australia. Is variance in temperature increasing, or is it just sort of the main story?
I guess it's super region specific. In the solitary islands, as I say, we're not sure that coral is expanding, but we have a beautiful kind of cross-shelf gradient where there's lots of corals in the islands where the East Australian current flows, and then closer inshore we have kelp forests. So what's interesting is whether the corals are starting to move in. We definitely know that in Japan the corals are expanding a lot faster. Is that to do with variance? I don't know. Sorry, just to finish. The other problem in these regions, is that the oceanography really matters, and it's one directional. So for example, in Western Australia, we've lost the kelp from 150 kilometers. Because the current is going this way, the new kind of kelp propagules are going to find it really difficult to repopulate. So even though the temperature now is very cold, there's no propagules to kind of bring it back. Plus, there's all these herbivores that are constantly grazing on the so that the oceanography also matters. Sorry.
These corals are reef-building corals, or?
Yeah, Acropora. Now, they're not accreting because the conditions are not right for accreting yet, and whether they will ever be able to accrete, I'm not sure, because as Chris mentioned, ocean acidification is also increasing, and corals obviously are very sensitive to that. So, and obviously corals also need light, and light is something that is not going to change with climate change. At a certain latitude, you're going to have certain day lengths with certain amounts of light. So it's not clear.
Of the two management strategies that you put out as options, which one do you think is more likely to get support at government levels, given research about genetically modified organisms versus evolution?
What I know is that we're already doing that research for corals, and like Madeleine Van Olfen and Bruce Gates, they've been doing it for a long time now. And in kelp, it's literally a few years. So I don't think that's because of management pressure. I just think it's a good question. Why is there more money for coral reefs? I don't know.
Do you think the loss of biodiversity because of tropicalisation is going to be greater in the southern hemisphere because we'll just run out of land to go just sheer loss of available habitat?
Yeah, I do. So what we're seeing at the local level is that there's actually an increase in biodiversity at the moment because we haven't lost a lot of the temperate species, but we have all these new ones arriving. So biodiversity at the moment is kind of growing, but as you say, species are going to, start to, it's like they're falling off a cliff edge after Tasmania. There's nowhere else to go. So I think in the southern hemisphere it's going to be a much greater problem. There's going to be extinctions, whereas in the northern hemisphere there's a lot of land all the way to the North Pole.
Please.
I'm interested in the experiments, I presume the experiments on the West Coast and the East Coast with the ecology. You must be seeding them, right? So
I should have put a photo. We have some that are seeded and some that are not.
Okay.
And I can tell you, the ones that are seeded in the east, we are getting help inside the cages, but in the west, we haven't seen any, even the ones that have been seeded. But we're still, it's ongoing, so it's completely,
Why are the tropical herbivorous fish so much better at eating the kelp
than the temperate species?
Well, I assume it's temperate,
Yeah, it's a good question. So one of the hypotheses is that because there's so many herbivores in the tropics, the seaweeds have evolved very complex chemical defenses and very potent chemical defenses. So when these tropical herbivores that are used to super toxic seaweeds come into a place where they're barely defended at all, and they just it's like a party, That's one of the hypotheses. And I've done a few experiments on that, and it's obviously, like everything, it's more complicated than that, but yeah.
So is the decline in the kelp initially, it dies because of the heat wave
in the West,
Western Australia, but in Eastern Australia, hasn't died because of the temperature, it's because of the grazers?
I think it's a combination of both. So, a lot of Thomas's papers show that at the warm edge of the distribution, kelp are just a little bit less resilient in general. They have lower reproductive output, so they're already kind of living at the edge and more vulnerable to anything. So when you have increased herbivory and then some temperature peaks, etc., they're more vulnerable to the combination of the stressors, and that's what causes them to disappear. So it's not just the herbivores.
What would you say is the relationship between the fish in the temperamental ocean and the fish that comes from the tropics? Because obviously there's original fish who live in the temperamental, like feeding the kelp, and what they prey on the newer fish, which I imagine tend to be smaller.
Yeah. So the question is about the effect of predators, like both, I guess, the temperate predators. All of a sudden, a new prey comes in, right? These tropical fish. What's their effect? And I think in places like Sydney, we only see the tropical herbivorous fish come in as babies, and they come in right now at the end of the summer, and then their numbers keep growing until about July, and most of them die and disappear, and we think it's because of predation from local temperate species. Because we're talking about really small fish, and they're not very good at living at those lower temperatures, so they get predated by the locals. That's what we think.
But they're not predated fast enough for their effect on kelp not be.
Well, so in Sydney, we still have kelp, and they're not having an effect. We're just seeing the very beginning of the new wave of herbivorous fish. So what I think is happening in the solitaries is that it's warm enough for these fish to actually survive through the winter, protect themselves against predators, so that's why they get to adulthood, and then they have this impact.
All right, cool. Thanks a lot, Adriana. Well, that's worked out well. It's set me up quite nicely to talk about how things are in New Zealand. So I'm the next speaker. I just have to thank myself for inviting myself to give a talk. But yeah, I guess honestly I thought this was a good chance to talk about climate change in New Zealand. It was basically a good chance to talk about the time series of temperature data that Bill Ballantine established at the Lee Marine Laboratory. And we see the papers coming out of Australia, Western Australia, all around the world of tropicalisation and all these exciting things happening, turning to coral reefs. And I was like, well, how come we're not seeing any of that here? And so that's what got me interested in looking at the time series at Lee, and then working with Melissa to look at Melissa Bowen from School of Environment here, who's a physical oceanographer, looking at how temperature changes how temperature is changing around New Zealand. So you've all seen the headlines this summer and last summer around marine heat waves. It's all kind of doom and gloom, and there's obviously real examples around the world where there are serious heat waves happening, and changes that have been happening, as we've seen in Adriana's talk. A lot of these headlines have actually come out in the last week in relation to a new paper or another paper that basically says that heat waves are increasing globally, which, yeah, they are. They're becoming more common, marine heat waves, more frequent globally. And as Adriana's shown, that these can lead to some pretty catastrophic changes, like in Western Australia here. This is the same species of kelp that we have around most of New Zealand, Ecology radiata, and as she said, over almost a couple of 150 kilometres or something like that. Those Ecology forests are now gone, and the herbivorous fish have come in. So that's in Western Australia. Last summer we had probably I think it was defined as New Zealand's biggest marine heat wave. News Hub referred to it, I think it was someone from Met Service referred to that the Tasman Sea was like a bath with the hot tap left on. And so this was it was an unprecedented event, and there's a paper by Jim Salinger just coming out on this marine heat wave. So these heat waves are happening on top of an already warming ocean, and we know that globally ocean temperatures are increasing on average. But when we look at it like this at a global scale, you can see that it's actually quite variable. So the different colours show you how much different areas are changing. So the warm areas that are warming fast are these red areas. We've had over a degree of warming over the last century, but you can see it's not warming up evenly, it's quite variable. And what you'll notice about these hotspots, I guess, is a lot of them are on the western side of these big ocean basins. And that's because with climate change, these big ocean gyres, this is the subtropical gyre, basically these gyres are speeding up. So with increasing winds over the Pacific, or over these ocean basins, they spin up these gyres, and what that means is we're getting warmer water pushed down poleward into some of these, they're referred to as western boundary current regions. And this is one of the area that Adriana's just talking about as an example. So warm water getting pushed down from the tropics, and this is the time series of temperature data from Maria Island off Tasmania, where the temperatures have been increasing about 0.2 degrees per decade, and she alluded to some of the changes that have happened there with new species turning up. So these changes are happening. There's more heat waves, warming, particularly in these western boundary current regions. New Zealand's smack bang in the middle here. right in this western boundary current region. What's happening here? Are we seeing increases in tropical species, more heat waves, and what can we expect in the future? Now, I'm particularly interested and hopeful that Goat Island is one day going to look like this, right? So we can suddenly become coral reef biologists and have lots of pretty species, pretty fish species, coral reefs to work on. I'm sick of doing quadrats in kelp forest, but that's one option. Alternatively, we might get some species turning up and increasing in abundance like this sea urchin, right, that's been a problem in Tasmania. We already have this in New Zealand, but is it going to increase and eat all the kelp? Or are heat waves going to become just way more common and the kelp's all going to die, and what's going to happen? So, luckily, we have 2 long-term temperature records in New Zealand where we can actually, well, the first step in understanding whether some of those things are going to happen and understanding whether they're going to happen, but also interpreting changes that we see in the marine environment or particular events in the marine environment, we need to know how the temperatures have been changing. And we have a long-term temperature record from Lee in northern New Zealand and from the Portobello Marine Lab in southern New Zealand. Now, obviously, the one at Lee was set up by Bill Ballantine. He was the first director or scientist in charge at the Marine Lab and started recording temperatures every day in, I think it was late 1966. He got the idea, though, it was good of him to start it there, but he actually got the idea from Betty Barton, who was the scientist in charge, or the director, I'm not sure what her title was, at the Portobello Marine Lab, which is the University of Otago University's Marine Lab, and that's in Otago Harbour. So there's about 65 or 66 years of daily temperature data from Portobello, which is down in this almost, well, it's still just inside the subtropical convergence, but very cold part of New Zealand. And then we have over 50 years of daily data from northern New Zealand. And these are, I think they might be the 2 longest daily temperature records in the southern hemisphere. The one at Maria Island, which is over here, is longer, but it's not daily. It's ship-based every 2 to 4 or even more weeks. So these 2 temperature data sets were set up, a long time ago, long before climate change was a thing, and it was sort of their foresight that has meant that these data sets are really valuable now in terms of understanding how the marine environment's changing. So, is it warming up? We have daily data going back now over 50 years, and the sort of standard way of looking at this data is to sort of calculate monthly temperature anomalies. So you remove the seasonal effect, and you can see whether the temperature is above or below the sort of average. And if we look at Lee temperature data here, from 1967 to last month, February, it's quite variable. From month to month, it's warmer or cooler, and you get these fluctuations through time, but there isn't really much of a long-term trend. And I think this is probably one of the only 50-year daily temperature records in the world that doesn't show an increasing trend. So coral reefs it's not looking hopeful at this stage. That line, there's periods of warm in the 70s there, then big El Nino events which drag the temperatures down. We're on a bit of an upward spike now, right? And that was the heat wave last year. So, not really any long-term change when we look at all of the data through time, or whether we even look at annual averages. Temperatures pretty much flatlining. Whereas if we look at Portobello, we actually see an upward trend. This is a significant positive trend. It's not as steep as what they're seeing in Tasmania. The slope of this line is about 0.11 degrees per decade. So you can see it's sort of fluctuating. Actually, you see the same sort of fluctuations between northern and southern New Zealand, but down in the south we have got this sort of upward trend. And then again you've got this sort of particularly warm, that's the heat wave last year, sort of a bit of an upward spike at the moment. So, different story between northern and southern New Zealand. But if we just dig into it a little bit more, this is just looking at all the monthly data, if we actually look at it by season, we see a bit of a different story. this is a bit might be hard to see, or a bit complicated. But effectively, I showed you the slope of those lines, right? As the Portobello one was about 0.1 degrees a decade. What I've plotted here is that's the slope on the y-axis, plotted against months. So we've calculated the trend for every month of the year, because some months we expected we're probably going to show greater warming or more warming than others. And if we look at the Lee data, we actually see that most months there's actually no warming trend, but what is it? May. Yeah, May and June we are seeing a bit of a positive trend. What we're seeing is the temperatures are staying warmer into sort of May and June. So we are seeing some evidence of warming at Lee, but really just in those months. If we look at Portobello, it's more through the winter months from April through to September. We're seeing warming at that time. So it is seasonally variable, and that's very different to what's going on in Australia. So what you can see in Tasmania there, I've got the Tasmania data plotted on there as well, every month's warmer, and the slope's much higher. So the warming we're seeing based on these long-term records around New Zealand is lower, and it's more variable seasonally. So just a quick, I'll go over this quite quick, but just sort of out of interest, when we've been plotting up this is the annual data for Lee, and what you can see is for the sort of first 40 odd years, it's hugely variable. You've got warm and cold years, and then for the last 10 years, it's been quite average to warm, right? So we've actually had quite a reduction in the interannual variability over the last 10 years. We don't really know what's going on there. This is the interannual variation, but we seem to be in a warm and fairly sort of less variable period for what it's worth. So there's these subtle kind of changes happening in the Lee data set that we need to probably try and understand a bit better. But it's certainly not showing the straight line kind of warming trends that we're seeing in other places. Okay, so that's the sort of warming trends over the last 50 odd years at those two locations. What about heat waves? Because the heat waves may be becoming more or less common. We can define a heat wave as a period of time when the water temperature, so more than 5 days, where the water temperatures are above the 90th percentile for that given day. So if you take all of the temperatures across all the years for a given day, it's looking at where it's greater than the 90th percentile. And there's some really nice packages, really nice package in R to generate these sort of plots, which basically show you all of the heat waves that have occurred in the Lee time series going back to 1967, based on that criteria. So there is different ways of defining it, but that's the sort of standard way of doing it. What you can see, so each of these is one of those heat wave events. What you can see is the biggest heat wave events on record were actually in the 70s at Lee. And that's the one, a couple of heat waves last year. So not only are we not really seeing an increase in warming trend, much of a warming trend in our temperatures, we're not seeing an increase in heat waves either at Lee. So far it's a pretty boring place as far as climate change goes. It might stay that way. Maybe not in the intertidal, we'll see. So this is obviously all seawater temperatures. And then we've just been through another summer. It's been on the news a few times while we're reaching heat wave conditions, but yeah, we've had one little heat wave that showed up in the February data. So if you look at sort of the number of heat waves per year, the total duration of heat waves, the overall intensity of the heat waves, we don't really see, there's no evidence of any increase at Lee. So what about Portobello? You'll see straight away what pops out is the heat wave last year. So it was a really big one, the biggest one on record, the biggest two on record at the Portobello Marine Lab. And what you can see is the sort of the frequency of these heat waves increases over time. And particularly last year, there was quite a cluster of heat waves. The heat wave last year, which Jim Salinger has written a paper about, one of the things that they were really excited about down in Otago was the fact that there was kingfish there. So it was great for fishing with all these warmer water species coming down. It wasn't so good for the giant kelp forests, which all died back. It wasn't so good for the yellow penguins. Yeah, what are they called? Yellow-eyed penguins. So yeah, there was real kind of major effects, not just in Portobello, but in the wider parts of areas around on the west coast and southern New Zealand. In the matter of time, I won't go over this. I've pretty much, you can see in this plot here that it is increasing in intensity and also in frequency of marine heat waves. This is just showing you, these are some of the plots you can get out of the marine heat wave package just that show the heat waves. The blue line is the mean temperature for those through time. This is over the last couple of years. And that's the green line is the 90th percentile, and so anything above that line, if it's red, is showing up as a heat wave. So you can see we had a couple of heat waves up at Lee in December there, but this was the real big heat waves happening down in Portobello around that time. It had those range of different effects. And then you can see, if you look at this summer, water temperatures have been about a degree warmer than normal, but we haven't had much in the way of heat waves over this last summer. Okay, so what's going on? Where's our coral reef? Where's all the nice pretty fish? Why aren't they turning up along the northeastern coast in huge numbers like what's been seen in Australia? What's going on? So what I've shown you is long-term data from 2 points, one in northern and one in southern New Zealand. So that provides a really important long-term perspective. What we can do with satellite data is get more of a regional view of how temperatures have changed. So satellite data is available now back to the 80s, early 80s, and so that can then be used to create more of a sort of a map of how water temperatures have changed, but remembering that it's over a shorter time frame. And so this, with the help of Melissa, we've generated, this has actually just been updated in our paper that we've written. It only went through to I think 2016. The story stayed pretty much the same. If we look over the last 37 years, and again looking at the trend through time, so the orange is showing you a really strong positive trend. Blue is not really much of a trend. The little dots mean there's no significant trend at all. And what you can see, Lee is up here, and really there's not a lot going, even over this shorter time period. There's not a lot in terms of an increasing warming trend. Whereas down by Portobello, you've got much stronger warming happening over time. And this is obviously the fairly intense warming that Adriana's been talking about. So this matches up quite nicely with what we're seeing in the long-term records, because this is, interpreted from satellite data. So what's happening? What's causing this? So just remembering back to those the big gyres that are speeding up and the currents are intensifying. So what's happening with the East Australian current is more water, as that intensifies, is pushed down into the southern Tasman, down to Tasmania. And what that means is less water is actually going into the top of the Tasman Sea and coming across in the Tasman front. And the modelling that's been done has shown that we actually expect to see over time less connection between New Zealand and the East Australian current. And so we're pretty sure that that's what's explaining the warming around southern New Zealand. I should have prefaced all of this by saying I wasn't a physical oceanographer, and all the questions can go to Melissa, who can talk around the answers. It is very complicated, and they're working on it, the physical oceanographers. But that's sort of the guts of it, as well. As as those currents change, this is a fairly complex boundary current region, and with more water coming down this way, that's likely to explain why we're not seeing much in the way of warming off the east Auckland current. So to sort of wrap up, I'm going to talk very offhand about what this means in terms of the marine ecosystems around the country and whether we are going to see tropicalisation. If we are going to have any tropicalisation, I think it's going to be much slower than obviously what's happening in eastern Australia. We don't have that just continuum of landmass with warming happening all the way down. we've got much lower rates of warming. This is, the yellow here is I think 0.1 or something, but that's over that shorter time frame. So our changes are much slower than happening in other places in northern New Zealand, and complex. We have this seasonal aspect to it, and so how that affects the ecosystems, that's another interesting kind of research question. Warming temperatures at a certain time of year, it's going to be much more subtle and more complex. As I've said, this connection between the East Australian current might decline, well, is expected to decline. So that may mean that some species we actually might see a decline in, depending on where they're coming from. If species are getting transported down and coming across from the East Australian current, like the packhorse lobster up the top there, they could decline over time. I mean, this is fairly speculative, but I guess it is difficult to predict. But what I don't think in northern New Zealand is we're going to see large or rapid changes, at least based on the trends that we've been seeing over the last 50 odd years, but things might change. Southern New Zealand is probably where the action is going to happen, where we are going to see changes, where we have been seeing changes with kelp forests, the giant kelp forests declining. Seen it is warming up. The heat waves are more common. Number of warm water species turning up down there, and species potentially are going to basically run out of land mass, as we were sort of referring to before. So if we're not really seeing much of a change in the sort of the biodiversity of northern New Zealand, but we're losing species from southern New Zealand, that's where we sort of come to this idea of, well, there's potentially going to be more of a sort of homogenisation of the sort of biodiversity around New Zealand. We'll see, I guess. So just to finish off, the trends obviously in warming around New Zealand are highly variable, and obviously not as great as what has been seen in a lot of these sort of real hotspots for climate change, where there's been really major ecological changes happening as well. We're seeing greatest warming in southern New Zealand. There is this complexity between, in terms of the timing as well as the spatial side of things. You've got to be careful when you start using global SST products. They can all give different answers. So I would recommend talking to a physical oceanographer before you do use any of them. I won't go into any more of that. Obviously, these long-term records are hugely valuable in detecting long-term changes. They do provide a longer-term view. They're real data than, compared to the satellite data, which is over a shorter period of time. I think we're likely to see most sort of greatest impacts in southern New Zealand. And I guess the question of the talk was, can we expect homogenisation, or was it tropicalisation or homogenisation? And I guess that will, play out over the next 50 years. We'll see. Okay. Thanks a lot, and I'll take any questions. The lecture, that reminds me, the lecture's being recorded. But I can edit it. But all of our lectures are recorded, and we do get the opportunity before they go to the students to get to edit them. So thanks to Melissa Bowen, who's here in the School of Environment, for the physical oceanography, working with her on that sort of thing. Also Rob Smith is an oceanographer down at Otago, who were trying to work up the heat wave analysis into a paper. And also importantly, thank you to, there's been a lot of people that have collected the long-term data over time at both of the marine labs since Bill and Betty Batham set it up. At Lee, Joe Evans sort of managed the water monitoring program for 40 odd years, then got taken over from John Atkins. Down in Otago, I don't have a great idea who sort of kept it going, but I know John Gillett here was really important in keeping the monitoring the water temperature records going. And then currently Doug Mackey is the manager of the lab down there, so he's the one that sort of sends me the data and is really interested in what's happening with their temperature data as well. So now I can take some questions. Thanks. Probably probably the most important slide. Yeah. Any questions? No?
Adriana alluded to it, that it's the winter lows which seem to be critical for whether things can survive through the next year. You're reminding to about being Portobello is that the greatest warming is during winter. Do you think that's going to have a big impact on levels of tropicalisation or not, rather than long-term maybe?
Maybe. At Lee, it's really May. It's really the strongest warming is in that May temperature, and to a lesser extent April and then June. The water temperature doesn't really bottom out till August and even September. So we're not seeing an increase in the minimum temperatures. Yeah. At Lee, I mean, you're not seeing an increase in the minimum or the maximum temperatures. It's sort of more like a seasonal shift in timing. At Portobello, it is the winter temperatures that are increasing, and the summer temperatures are, with the exception of the heat wave last year, their summer temperatures have been very kind of constant. It's going to, yeah, I mean, I think we're just looking at the low end of a temperature. You know, as far as temperature changes around the world go, we're not in a very exciting region. Which is great, but I mean, great in terms of status quo. But you know, that's not to say that we're not going to have impact. You know, periodic heat waves like last year, which I didn't mention, had big impacts on the mussel industry in the Hauraki Gulf, and so there will still be, those things are likely to still become more common, but at least we're not seeing it yet in the existing data. Any more questions? Yeah.
Could you elaborate on your caution around the SST coastal data? Because I use both Lee Portobello and stuff from NASA, from the EOS, and I was just wondering what that caution was.
Well, so they have some global reconstructed products that go back a long way. And I think that's what is used in any of those, like that recent heatwave paper that they're talking about changes over the last 100 years. And that is a really sort of a model reconstructed data set. That probably captures big ocean basin stuff, but it definitely won't tell us anything about changes around the New Zealand coast. But the perhaps more worrying thing that we've figured out more recently is that some of the satellite products based on satellite data can give a bit of variation in terms of the complexity of the patterns. I mean, they still all manage to capture those, big warming patterns off eastern Australia, but depending on, quite what data you look at, you can get a bit of a change, bit of variation. I'm really hesitant to show you. Sorry, but this is an example. This is this is another one of analysis that's done on satellite data, and it sort of paints a bit of a different story in terms of where the big warming's happening around New Zealand, and we've got to try and figure out why it differs. We might have to follow up with Phil about that one. On that note, there is huge amounts of information available now in terms of, easily available on temperature from, NOAA and whatnot. This is a current kind of, from a few days ago, the temperature anomaly globally. So the current data is really easily accessible. That's showing sort of, the warmer than average conditions in the Tasman at the moment. Mary.
So it may be that it's the west coast and probably the intertidal communities that may be the hardest hit by temperature change. Chris, do you come back in a few years' time to do some more work there? Because if we are going to get some consistent patterns, it may be that the west coast is where we will see it. But of course, that's the most difficult place to work and where we have the least historical data.
Yeah, and that reminds me, and I talked to Chris about it, who was going to say it, and we both forgot. The air temperatures in Auckland are forecast to increase, the number of hot days is forecast to increase by 70 a year by the end of within 50 years or something. I don't know the exact details, but there's a NIWA report being done for Auckland Council showing the forecasted number of hot days, so above 25, and that's really ramping up. So that's going to be, and that will obviously have impacts on rocky, not all intertidal habitat. Sorry for you, benthic people up the back there, sediment people up the back there. So that's, those hot days will have impacts on the intertidal, but they also will influence how much sort of solar warming there is of the coastal ocean, or like in some of the embayments, so how much the water's warming up each day. So all of these temperature measurements, the long-term measurements, are taken at 9 in the morning, so they don't really, it captures the broader sort of temperatures in the sort of ocean, in the area, whereas it's not capturing the sort of daily increase that occurs through solar warming. So, with the ramping up sort of air temperatures, we may see other sorts of changes in the water temperatures as well as on the intertidal.
I comment more than a question. But in our data from the solitary islands, we are seeing homogenization as well. Like, even though at a local reef there might be an increase in biodiversity, when we look at comparisons between sites, everything's starting to look the same. And I think even in places where these tropical species are expanding their distribution, homogenization is gonna happen. It's gonna be a few winners that just take over.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm very excited to know that in New Zealand there's still going to be beautiful trout forests, at least in the north side.
Yeah. Yeah. We've got to think on the bright side, right? Okay. Well, thanks a lot. We're going to finish off now with Mels giving out the Ocean Champion Award. Right, do you want to just, you can introduce yourself. Thanks.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks very much to Chris and Adriana. It's really interesting. I think the thing that's come through to me is a massive plug for our Marine Metre Squared Seashore Monitoring Citizen Science project, because the rubber is going to hit the road in the intertidal area in terms of seeing change. So all you people that are out there doing Marine Metre Squared, and if you're not doing it, should be doing it, keep doing it, because keep those metre squares going over a long period of time, because that's where we're going to see the changes happening. Okay, kia ora koutou. My name's Mels Barton, and I'm the National Coordinator of Seaweek. I'm also the Auckland Coordinator, so this is one of our big events in Auckland, so thank you all very much for coming. I think it's been fascinating what we've heard today. Really good to have that international angle on it. And I'm going to talk to you about Seaweek and about the national competition that we've been running here this year. So Seaweek you're in the middle of it right now. We're right in the thick of it, and we've got another big weekend of events coming up this weekend. Seaweek actually pretty much goes on all year. We've had events started in September, and they're going to go through until May, June. So it's not just a week or 10 days for us, we live it. We have a fantastic theme this year, which I think personally should be the Seaweek theme for all time, and that's Te Akina o Tātou Moana, and that's caring for our seas, and that is really what Seaweek is all about. We've heard a lot about Bill Ballantine, so I'm not going to tell you anything about him, because I don't think I need to this time. But he's the father of Marine Reserve. These are the sponsors for Seaweek this year. I really want to thank all of them, because we couldn't do it without them, but I particularly want to pick out Foundation North, who give us funding for Auckland and Northland, and we absolutely could not run Seaweek on the scale that we do without the funding that we get from Foundation North. For this event, we also have particular sponsors, obviously thanks to the University of Auckland for giving us this lecture theatre, and Nick. But we also have some major sponsors for the competition that we've been running. The New Zealand Coastal Society have been on board since 2014, I think, sponsoring this competition. And this year they're sponsoring the Senior Award, but we have new sponsors who've come on board to sponsor the Junior Award. This time we've split it into junior and senior, so we've got the Auckland Whale and Dolphin Safari, the Outboard Boating Club of Auckland, and also HarperCollins Publishers New Zealand, who've been sponsoring some books that we've been sharing around the place this year, and so I've chucked one of those into the prizes for the juniors, so thank you to them. Seaweek is very much online. You can find us in all of those places. But what I'm going to tell you about now are our junior ocean champions. So we did the Ocean Champion Awards a little bit differently this year. What we decided to do is split it into juniors and seniors, but we also asked our nominees, if you like, instead of just being nominated, we asked them to present themselves with a challenge and tell us what their ocean challenge was going to be and how they were going to do it. So that really has been quite an interesting, this first year that we've done this, and it's been really interesting, and we've had some really inspiring challenges put forward by some of our entrants. So I think it's been a good thing for us to do. So these are the entrants for the Junior Ocean Champion. The first one is Room 6 from Brooklyn School in Motueka. And this is a group of years 7 and 8 students. And their ocean challenge that they set themselves was the Kaitiritiri Amazing Race. So they wanted to champion developing awareness and the values of sustainable futures for their environment. They set up this amazing race to have stations that students went round where they had different activities, discussions and thinking at each station. And the Brooklyn School hosted this race, sharing their knowledge and understandings as well as having specialists running some of the stations. And they opened it to schools, primary schools in their region. They've run this race during Seaweek. They've had over 150 students attend, and it's now going to become an annual thing that happens in the Upper South Island. So I really take my hat off to Brooklyn School. They have gone for it and they've done this awesome job. So I'm very, very impressed with Brooklyn School Motueka. Yeah, give them a round of applause. Our second entrant is James Daniel. James lives in Pakuranga in Auckland, and he often goes to Eastern Beach on sunny days after school with his little sister, where they play for hours around the rocks and they pick up all the rubbish they can find. So his ocean challenge was the Eastern Beach rubbish hunt. And he took his little friend Spencer, his sister, and her friend Jasmine to see how much rubbish they could pick up on Eastern Beach. And I heard that they went to a clean-up the other day and brought 2 massive car tyres out. So I think it's a great job, James, keeping it local. Our next entrant is the Sunny Hills Going Gold Enviro team, and this is a school in Pakuranga, and this is a group of year 4, 5s and 6 that meet once a week to research, plan and take action for their school and environment. The ocean challenge they set themselves was marine metre squared in Farm Cove. So they're concerned about the health of their local marine environment in Farm Cove, and they're tracking the plant and animal life in the Tamaki estuary by taking part in Marine Metre Squared Citizen Science Project. It's pretty muddy down there, and having done the Marine Metre Squared with them in Farm Cove, I can say we haven't lost any children, but we have lost some gumboots. So well done to Sunny Hills. Keep it up, keep it going. We need that daily. Kins Mission Heights. Kins Mission Heights is in Flatbush, Auckland, and it's an early learning centre, and it's a branch of the Auckland Kindergarten Association. So they have children from age 2 to 5. It's an accredited Enviro school, and they're on a mission to create responsible young citizens for the future of Aotearoa. The Ocean Challenge they set themselves was keeping their local beaches clean, and they organised a 1-hour clean-up campaign at a local beach with the whole Kins community and the local community, so that they could have more people participate and bring in more awareness of looking after their beaches. So well done, Kins Mission Heights. Koka's here. So Te Koka class of Waiheke Primary School. This is a year 4-5 class at Waiheke Primary School. And after discussions about many marine problems, their class inquired into the problem of coral bleaching because it was the one that they knew the least about. So they set themselves the ocean challenge of Te Koka young scientists investigate coral bleaching. And first of all, they educated more people about the problem of coral bleaching and how bad that problem is. Their top 3 wishes are to create a marine protected area, natural sunscreen, and environmentally friendly boats. And they've created a whole presentation, which you can see on our website, about how they're going to do that. So I'm quite impressed with Te Koka. Great work. Hope you can do it. Oh dear. This always happens to me at one stage during this. The photograph doesn't show up. So, but fortunately, let's hope oh no, I was going to say hopefully the other photograph from Macquarie School was going to come up. But there are 2 classes from Macquarie School, which is near Gisborne on the East Cape. They're both Year 4 classes, Room 3 and Room 4, and they're really passionate about their environment, trying to make positive changes. Their ocean challenge was Save Our Seas. And so they participated in 3 beach cleanups, and they're doing the Citizen Science Marine Metre Squared project, and collaboration with Murray Palmer and his organisation Ngā Mihi Te Tau. And this year they're aiming to visit the Marine Reserve and local beaches and compare the results of their observations and findings. So good work, Room 3 and Room 4 from Macquarie School. Keep it up. A bit close to home, we've got the Orewa Estuary Army from Orewa College, Year 8 students, and they set themselves the ocean challenge of being the Orewa Estuary Army. And what they wanted to do was identify the impact of human encroachment on marine life in the Orewa Estuary, to research the effects of the problems, generate and create a solution to the identified problems. So they haven't told us what those problems are because they're investigating them at the moment. So we look forward to finding out what they do. So thanks very much, Orewa. Great work. And the final entrant in the junior is Happy Steps from Dargaville. This is another early learning centre with children aged 0 to 5 years. Their ocean challenge was Happy Steps into the Future. And they want their children to experience an environment where they're going to develop working theories and make sense of the natural world, to take care of Tangaroa and everything it has to offer, to extend the children's interest and knowledge around sustaining our kaimoana and what it takes to look after it to become a kaitiakitanga of the sea. So during Seaweek, they were going to have lots of knowledge sharing, fun, exciting activities and information for the tamariki and any whānau who wish to join them. So well done, Happy Steps. That's great. Thank you very much. Okay, so we have some sponsors, and I'm just wondering whether we've got anyone from Auckland Whale and Dolphin Safari or the Outdoor Boating Club here tonight. No, we don't. In that case, I'm going to ask the New Zealand Coastal Society's Paul Klinak to come and draw the winners. We've got 3 sets of prizes for our Junior Ocean Champion, and I've got them all in here. Apologies for the plastic, but it was easier to carry. So Paul, pick the first place winner.
So the first place winner is Room 6, Brooklyn School, Motueka.
I think that's very well reserved. So I don't suppose anybody's flown up from Motueka by any chance, have they? No. So what they're going to win is, I'll just show you, a certificate. And they're going to win a goodie bag from the Outdoor Boating Club, which has got snorkel gear and all sorts of stuff. But also what they're going to win, and they're going to have to fly up for this, but they're going to win the Auckland Whale and Dolphin Society's voucher for family pass plus $500 on a photo credit card, basically. So that's a pretty good prize. So well done, Brooklyn School. Okay, second place. Tikoka from Waikiki. Fantastic. Come on down, Tikoka. Excitingly, I know you're going to like this. Yep. Oh, well, there you go. So you get that as well as all the goodies. So you can take that as well as all the goodies. Awesome. From the Outboard Boating Club. I'll be a bit biased because they're one of my NO2 classes.
Room 4, Makoti School.
Oh, great. So they didn't get their photo up, but they did win a prize. Fantastic. That's great. So thanks very much. We'll send all of those winners their prizes. Okay. Now the big prize. The Senior Ocean Champion. So this is sponsored by the New Zealand Coastal Society, and they've been supporting this competition since 2014. So we really thank them for doing that. The entrants are Lorella Doherty. Lorella's from Taranaki, and she started Rethinking Plastic Revolution a few years ago because she was getting really depressed doing her daily beach cleans, because no matter how much plastic she picked up, there was always more the next time. So she decided to start an organisation called Rethinking Plastic Revolution, where she educates and inspires others to rethink their throwaway plastic use. So she set herself an ocean challenge, which was to pick up 10,000 cigarette butts in 10 days, because cigarette butts are made of plastic. So over the 10 days of New Zealand's Seaweek this year, she's been collecting 1,000 cigarette butts a day in New Plymouth, in beaches, parks, and she's been using a Pledge Me campaign to raise funds so that she can continue to educate and raise awareness about this. So I think that's a very impressive challenge to have set yourself, and I hope she's managed to, well, she won't have finished it yet, she'll still be at it. So well done, Lorella, that's fantastic effort. Yuen Wong. This young lady is from Canterbury, and she's a passionate environmental advocate, innovator, and she's founded a plastic pollution organisation called PS Our Beaches. And this is working to rid our beaches, waterways and oceans of single-use plastics. So the challenge that she set herself was EnviroPast, Plastic and Sustainability Talks, a conference. So this conference is all about moving forward with plastic pollution and inspiring young people to make real positive change in their lives and in the lives of others. It will take place on the 12th and 13th of April, with one day of speaker sessions and another day of hands-on activities such as workshops and a tree planting at Styx Mill in conjunction with Trees for Canterbury. She hopes that through EnviroPast she can provide not just a conference that comes and goes, but a space for all youth to network with those passionate about the same issues that they are and take those issues forward. So well done, Yuen Wong. And our final entrant in the Senior Ocean Champion this year is the organisation leopardseals.org, who have been in the news a little bit lately. So leopardseals.org is a national research group that's run entirely by volunteers who dedicate their time to promote the research, advocacy and management of leopard seals in New Zealand. And their ocean challenge was living alongside leopard seals. So although leopard seals are considered an Antarctic or subantarctic species, they do travel northward and New Zealand is part of their range. And so they've been sighted all over New Zealand. They're present all year round, and therefore we get quite a lot of human leopard seal interactions going on, some of which are positive and some of which are negative. And that can have considerable impacts on human safety and animal welfare. And so they wanted to create a program that gave opportunities for local communities to become actively involved in leopard seal research and conservation and promote coexistence between humans and leopard seals in New Zealand. And so they've created a program and opportunities for you to report leopard seal sightings and get more educated about leopard seals and how better we can protect them. So I think that's a really worthwhile and long-standing, something that's going to carry on going and not just be for this competition. So very valuable work. Thank you very much to leopard seals for all arriving to that challenge. So I think that all of our Ocean Champion entrants this year for the seniors, they've set themselves some really inspiring and important challenges. And even though we've only had 3 entrants, I think the standard has been exceptionally high. And what they've tried to do in their challenge is something that's going to go forward into the future. It's not just a one-off for this competition. So I think we've sparked something here that's really quite important, and I hope that those people follow through and get something out of it. So it would be really, really good. So now for the moment of truth. I'll bring Paul Klingert back here from the New Zealand Coastal Society to tell us all about the winner.
Thank you. Just a bit of a plug for the New Zealand Coastal Society. For those that aren't members or would like to be members, the Coastal Society was formed in 1992 to promote and advance knowledge and understanding of the coastal zone. It's a really active society. It encourages discussions like we've been having tonight, which has been really great. The standard of the presentations tonight have been absolutely brilliant. So well done. Check us out on the website and think about whether you'd like to become members. Very worthwhile. Conference for us is coming up at the end of this year in Invercargill, actually, in November. So it'll be quite an interesting conference. So the award tonight is a grant from the New Zealand Coastal Society for $500 towards, or to benefit towards the work that the winner is currently doing. And the winner is Lorella, go ahead, Pete.
Thank you, everyone. So I believe quite deeply that we are all kaitiaki of the earth, and my passion lies in the ocean. So that's where my guardianship lies. Thank you to the speakers. They were really, really interesting, and I loved hearing about what you guys are up to and your role as kaitiaki as well, and what you guys are passionate about. Where you talked about the data collection, so my data collection is plastic. I've been collecting plastic off the beaches for, since I was a kid actually with my dad, and now it's something I do with my kids as well. And I'll just take it back a little bit, that a few years ago I was collecting plastic on the beach with my children, and it's just, you all obviously love the ocean, just like I do. That's why you're here, listening to the speakers. And yeah, just this overwhelming sadness engulfed me, because there I was another day collecting another bag of plastic, and if anything, I was watching it get worse. And so I believe it's really important to tap into the sadness, because that also helps us move forward and make changes, because that's where passion lies as well, and feeling things deeply. So that's when I created Rethinking Plastic Revolution. And when I do my beach cleans, I collect, if you saw the picture of the world mural that I made, I collect the plastic and I take it home with me and I document it and I keep the statistics of how much I've found and what I'm finding. And something that I was doing was I was leaving all the cigarette butts because they contaminate my plastic. So I was kind of turning a blind eye to cigarette butts being plastic. And so I started noticing the cigarette butts one day as I was walking past them and finding an astronomical amount on the beach as I was walking past them. And I realised I couldn't turn a blind eye to these dirty things any longer, which are plastic and highly toxic. And of course they get dropped in the gutters and then they make their way down the gutters, out the storm drains and out to our waterways, and are having really terrible effects on the aquatic life. Studies. I studied marine biology at Canterbury University, so I loved reading scientific studies and things like that. So some studies that have been done have shown that one cigarette butt in a litre of water is enough to kill some aquatic life, small marine fishes and sea life. So, they have pretty harmful consequences. So they're not something that we should be turning a blind eye to anymore. But smoking, dropping cigarette butts is like a social norm. It's something that a lot of us don't realise. Most people don't believe or don't realise that they are plastic and that they don't break down, when in actual fact they don't break down. If they do break down just into those 12,000 tiny little cellulose acetate fibres. So my project of collecting 10,000 cigarette butts, I'm up to day 7, so I'm at the count of 7,500 so far. It's really smelly, and I'm doing about 1,000 squats a day, so my legs are really sore. But it's really fun as well. So it's been pretty cool, and the awareness is really spreading, because I just believe that when people know this, that behaviours can change. So that's what I'm hoping to, with these 10,000 butts, to be able to really show quite strongly and spread it out there that they are plastic and that they don't break down and that behaviours need to change. Basically.
Thanks very much. Well, I hope we didn't disturb you too much from your butt collecting, dragging you all the way up here. Okay, so I'd just like to do a little plug for what else was happening during Seaweek. You've probably got 2 pieces of paper that were given to you by Bronwyn when you came in. One of them is a little flyer for some of the other events that are happening this week. So take a look at that. But all of the events are listed on our website. We've had over 50 events in Auckland, 200 all over the country. So hop on the website and have a look what else is happening. This is just a little taster. And the other one is a competition, again. If you go home tonight, we'd love you to fill in an event report on our website and tell us what you thought of this event. It's really important to us to get statistics and some feedback from the people that have attended events so that we can feed back to our sponsors. We do a huge evaluation of Seaweek every year. It's one of the things that keeps getting us funding, but we need data in order to be able to do that. So please fill in your form, and you could win one of those fantastic books that I just gave to Takoka that I was so excited about. Yep. Because that's what's in the prize draw. So, and we're also doing some special prize draws for some of the Auckland events, because we've been given all sorts of things like Kelly Tarleton's vouchers and Ted Ashby sailing vouchers and stuff. So we've got these vouchers to give away. So we'll give one away tonight for something. So fill in those forms and you could get a voucher for something cool as well as. Okay. So the only thing that's left for me to do really is to thank our speakers tonight, because I think they've really opened a door for us to understand a little bit about what's changing in our environment globally. So I would like to thank Adriana. Hopefully you can eat over on the plane.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. I've got one for Chris too. Thank you very much. And something special for Nick for his efforts. Thank you very much for doing this for us again.
Made it through another year.
We've made it through another year for Seaweek.
I'll put myself down for a talk next year as well.
Yeah, cool. Writes it down. Okay, so thank you all very much for coming. We'll let you go home now.